I love horror movies. I'm a big horror movie fan. I don't get scared in horror movies. I respond to suspense. I respond to that. But, what's going to happen next? And I can jump by a boo scare, but that's not really terror. I don't get scared in movies. The thing I got scared in, and I was scared, and it made me want to put it under a microscope about why I was actually frightened during that movie. And I think the reason is this, is because the paranoia is bouncing off of the four walls, bouncing, the fear, the paranoia, bouncing, until it has nowhere to go except through the fourth wall into the audience.
Oh, friends, it is Halloween season, and we got a great interview for you today. I'd like to introduce you guys today to my friend, Chris Robichaud. Chris is a senior lecturer in ethics and public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, where he teaches ethics and public policy leaders from the U.S. and around the world. His instructional methods, among traditional kinds, also includes games and simulations of his own design. He's presented on these at TED, and in addition to his academic work, he is an author and editor of popular volumes on pop culture and philosophy, which is where I first met him. He's the editor, for example, of Dungeons and Dragons and Philosophy, Read and Gain Advantage on All Wisdom Checks. Chris, welcome to Tabletop Tune Up. We're so glad to have you today.
Thanks so much for having me. Super excited to chat with you.
I want to just start with a very brief story about when I visited Chris at Harvard last year. As I was there for something else on a work trip, I go to meet Chris, and he's very gracious. He makes some time for me and my colleague to come up and ask him about the simulations he's been running. And so we get over there to the Kennedy School, and you walk through there, and it's just this very clean halls, this amazing place. You can kind of feel the power running through there. This is where future heads of state are getting trained in statecraft. I get to Chris's office, and I'm like, well, I've got no question about whose office this is. And it's great. Mark, I sent you a couple pictures of the pictures I took there.
Yeah, Chris, you're just a big old nerd.
I can't hide it. I've tried.
I love it.
Yeah.
There's a fantastic doormat that says roll for initiative. He's got a picture of Captain America on like a poster, like one of the old school Golden Age, I think it is. It's such a mix of stuff in your office. It's pop culture, Universal monsters, Godzilla, old time radio plays. And then all of this is kind of interleaved with academic books of the highest caliber. Help me out, man. How did you get there?
Well, that's a long story, right?
Yeah.
But I've always been a collector of toys and other sorts of gadgets. And I just, as you can imagine, there's no space that I can really occupy that doesn't have some or other of those things. So when I was moved into the Center for Public Leadership at the Kennedy School, which is the office that you visited, it's a nice sort of corner office and nice display. I was like, well, I'm a big believer that we can't really separate culture from politics. And I'm also a big believer that horror and science fiction and fantasy and superheroes have some things to teach us. And so I was like, let's just lean into this. I will say that it is meant to, in a constructive and productive way, disorient some students when they come in because they don't quite know what to make with it. What do you make with, like, I just recently got the little face hugger, I'm putting this in quotes, sort of a life-size face hugger that's like creeping up over the couch. And you just
wants to hug you.
Yeah, exactly.
That's all it wants to do.
Exactly.
Free hugs.
Exactly. So I enjoy people's reactions, and there's always a story associated with this, that, or the other thing. I haven't taken out of the box yet. I got a replica of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre chainsaw. This was Trick or Treat Studios put this out with official Texas Chainsaw Massacre sounds. I'm like, this is perfect. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
That's amazing. I love that you brought all that with you. So Chris, obviously we're here to talk about horror today. Can you tell us, I feel like if I said, what's your favorite horror film or novel, that would be an impossible task. But what are some of the big ones that come to mind for you? What are your favorite influences?
Well, I knew that I would be asked this question, and I found myself starting to answer it. I said I'm going to be very brief. I'm going to have like a one or two example answer. And by the time I was done, I ended up with a list of my top 25 horror films and my top 25 horror books. I don't know if we have time for me to subject you to that. I can rattle them off really quickly if you'd like.
Just pick a couple. Pick one or two.
Now that's fair. Even though I do think, for what it's worth, I mean, I'll just sort of lean into this at the start of our conversation. I think to be a good game master in this space, you do need to watch a lot of horror films and you do need to read a lot of horror fiction and you need to learn the tropes and you need to internalize them. My favorite horror movie of all time, my personal favorite, I don't know if it's number one of all time, but my personal favorite is The Exorcist. It traumatized me as a kid. I watched it, unfortunately, God bless my mother, may she rest in peace, but she showed it to me way too young when I was roughly the age of Reagan. And of course, the human capacity to sort of associate with what you're seeing, I immediately became Reagan in my head, and all that was happening to Reagan, I imagined could happen to me. And you know, it's one of those films where I don't quite get it because folks are like, yeah, it's such a powerful ending. I'm like, the demon wins. I mean, the demon causes two priests to die, and then just sort of finally goes on its way. Like, Reagan's saved, but one priest has a heart attack. The other one throws himself out of a window. That's the ending of The Exorcist. It's a dark, dark movie.
Welcome to horror.
But to me, the dread of that movie, the real effectiveness of it, isn't. It's the shocks help lead to it, but the dread of that movie is that when that camera is moving up the stairs towards the last third of that movie, and it regularly does this, moves up the stairs, it turns the corner, it approaches the door, and you don't want to go in. You're just, please God, don't open that door again. That's a really successful horror movie for me.
The stakes in that movie are so big. You got the soul of this child. I mean, they can't be bigger.
It can't be bigger. It's this cosmic battle. You're thrown off your game at first when I was raised Catholic, so this was this really hit home. When the priest first comes, when Father Karras first comes, and he's like, he sees the demon. I'm thinking to myself, all right, here we go, like Karras, the church, and the demon instead is like, yeah, let's do this. I can't wait for this. I'm like, what? I'm like, that's unnerving to me. I'll just add on the other side of it, my favorite horror novel of all time is Stephen King's It. That again, I read that too young. There's a theme going on here. But my mother read it, passed it along to me. This would be fine for you, Christopher. But that novel is to me a masterpiece of the macabre. Most horror fiction, I think, is best in the short story form. But it takes real art to be able to extend it over a novel length. It takes particular art to be able to extend it over hundreds and hundreds of pages. But King pulls it off. And it is creepy and unnerving and delightful.
The three of us are kind of at an age, I would say, that when we were maybe like in junior high or even younger, those Stephen King novels were kind of creeping up in the zeitgeist. And we were, as kids, these were like forbidden little books we would kind of trade amongst each other. I don't remember how it was for you guys, but I distinctly remember reading those books with friends.
Oh, for sure. And I think my parents at the time and many parents at the time were sort of like, well, they're reading.
Yeah.
They got this big, thick book. I'm so proud. They're reading this. Yeah. And I'm like, yes, we're reading.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, I'll tell you what, we also got to hear Quentin's take on one of his favorite movies, The Thing, which is one of my favorite ones as well. It's
made my list also.
It's just that bottle episode where they're just trapped in a confined space, which raises the stakes so much. But hey, what is it that we love? What is it that we love about horror movies?
It's a great question. I mean, this is one that folks have puzzled over. I'm in a reading group now with a few philosophers, and we're rereading Noel Carroll's sort of seminal text on this, The Philosophy of Horror. And he generates several paradoxes, but one of the paradoxes is this aesthetic paradox. Like, why do we find it pleasurable? And we do, because we pay money and we get our popcorn and we watch these things. Why do we find it pleasurable to watch, monsters and ghouls and to get ourselves scared? And of course, no one has the answer to this. Noel Carroll spends hundreds of pages talking about it. No one has the answer. For me, I think one of the things, I don't think there's the answer, but I think one of the things is there is a need that we all have to explore the monstrous. Because the real monstrous, the non-metaphorical monstrous often does creep into our lives. And sometimes there is a kind of catharsis in being able to explore that in a safe, imaginative, fun way. Again, I don't think this is the only reason, but I do remember at times having to explain to people who would dismissively say, "Oh, I don't watch horror movies. There's enough horror in real life." I'd be like, "Well, I don't think you may appreciate what horror does." And one of my favorite examples, the 1954 Godzilla, when that movie was first shown to audiences in Tokyo and elsewhere throughout Japan, people were weeping, right? But it was made by the Japanese for the Japanese, right? And it was a way for them to come to terms with what had happened to them and what they, in part, had wrought upon themselves. And that is a very powerful. And it turned out that the way to do that was not anything other than a giant radioactive lizard. And I don't think it's an accident that Godzilla has gone on to become a staple of Japan, kind of a hero of Japan. My point ultimately is, I think it is a way for us to explore some dark corners in a fairly safe and fun way.
I don't tend to get into horror as much as I think you guys do, but you're talking me into it.
Chris, you got to send your list to Ben when you're done with this.
I'm gonna send a list, because I had to stop myself at 25, because really anything less than 100 I find annoying, the choices that I have to make. But I tried breadth and depth.
It can be required viewing, you guys.
I'll look forward to that list. A lot of that list, I'm certain now, I will not have already consumed.
Why don't you send a list to us, and we'll actually put it on the notes.
Oh,
so
fantastic!
Enjoy.
That's great. Sure, awesome. Thank you.
So we've talked about what it is that we love about horror a little bit, and we've talked about the catharsis, and let's actually make the turn toward games now. So you're a GM, Chris, as you're thinking about the horror genre and running horror games, and you have run horror games. I've actually been in one, and I thought it was delightful and effective. What are we going for in terms of the experience at the table? Obviously, you're not going to probably be, doing violence or, killing small animals or, invoking ancient gods. Maybe you'll invoke ancient gods at the table. I don't know.
Old Satanic Panic, the 1980s, we were supposed to be doing that just by rolling the dice. I wondered what I was doing wrong, because there was all this cool stuff that was supposed to be happening. All
nobody showed up. Huh?
Yeah. The only thing I was getting was pimples playing Dungeons & Dragons.
Oh, no. Okay. So, but at the table, what kind of experience are we going for there? Is it like what we're doing in a horror movie, or is it something else, something in between?
I think it can be a couple of things, right? So I do think there are some small press indie horror games that really do try to come close to producing high tension what is going on. I'm thinking of Dread.
Oh, yeah.
Where you have the Jenga tower, which when I first heard that, I was like, that sounds pretty silly. But having played it through a few times, that is a fantastic mechanism for, is this the action that's going to cause the whole thing to come crashing down?
So real quick, for those who aren't experienced with Dread, the whole game is based on the storytelling, and to do actions, you are actually building a Jenga tower and removing pieces from it. So that anxiety of pulling the pieces out matched with the anxiety of the story, that's what we're kind of talking about.
Yeah, no, I highly recommend it. I think it's a great, that's the sort of thing that you do in a night, is Dread. So one thing we may want to do with a game is to try to recreate some high tension, and a game like Dread, I think it does a good job of showing how that's done. On the other end of the scale, when we say we want a horror game, what we may really mean is not the dread, not the scare. We just want to sort of enter a world that has our classic horror monsters. And here I do play a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, but I'll use that merely as an example. We want a Dungeons & Dragons session that's horror. What might that mean? It might mean we're fighting the vampire in the crumbling castle, Strahd and Ravenloft. It might mean we're fighting the werewolves or the mummies. It might mean we're going on some Lovecraftian horror thing. So there, I think it's really just, we want the horror stuff. I find myself most interested in the in-between between those two things. So not necessarily the high tension of a Dread, but a little bit more bite than just let's go fight a bunch of classic monsters.
A little bit more like Aliens and less Freddy Krueger.
Exactly. And so for me, the trick with those sorts of games, and this is the challenge with them, is it's a cooperation between the GM and the players. What I have found, and this is just my own personal experience, is I need buy-in from the players to bring characters that are vulnerable. And that is because in most horror film and fiction, characters are vulnerable and really realize that they can lose it all, that terrible things can happen to them and their friends, that they're not going to power their way out of this, that if they do beat the big bad, it's going to have to take an extraordinary effort, and it won't just be a few lucky rolls. And so whether it's the newer version, the 5th edition of Vampire, where the vulnerability comes in with any moment, really, you can just go into blood rage and kind of completely lose it. Or whether it's the old school Call of Cthulhu, where there's a magical book, I'm not reading it. Here's a magical artifact, I'm not touching it. Here's a cult, we're going the other direction, because you're so fragile that anything that you encounter could have you lose your mind. I'm running now a Dungeons and Dragons horror game that I've designed myself, and I'm having people play with old school rules, with the rules of BX, with using old school essentials. And the reason for that is because those characters are just squishier, and not just in the like can live or die, but they aren't just walking sets of powers. And that vulnerability helps, in my view, create the atmosphere for a good horror story.
100% on that. You had mentioned something just in that reply about player buy-in, and that kind of leads to my next question. I can't even think of another genre of game that requires more buy-in than a horror game. It could make or break a game. How do you do anything to ensure that you have buy-in before you even start?
For sure. Nowadays, and I understand this, it's different than the way that I grew up. And nowadays, we are all encouraged as game masters to sort of ask players before we start anything, what are your deal breakers? I do something quite similar to that with horror, but I sort of say in the best of ways, like, horror is supposed to take us to uncomfortable places. And so I really need to know that you're willing to go to uncomfortable places, because the things that understandably would bother some players are the very tropes that horror uses. Body horror, right?
Yeah.
An invasive assault. I mean, that's what vampires do. That's what werewolves do. If you've lost someone in your family, death. Well, I mean, we're in crypts and ghouls. Horror by design is meant to take us into the places that we're somewhat, hesitant to go. So I do get feedback. I do want feedback from players about, what might still be too much. But more, I'm just like, are you into that kind of a journey? Are you into going to those places in a fun way? Because it's got to be fun too. But nonetheless, we got to go there. It's not horror. It's something else.
If you're asking your players to make a dexterity check to get their keys out and operate to get that lock, and they're like, it's a free action, I don't need to make a dex check. You're in a horror game, my friend.
You are in a total horror game. That's right. It's all of this is high tension and high stress. That's right. Yeah.
Mark, you talk about a dex check like that, and Chris, you talked a moment about vulnerability. So for people who are maybe aspiring to this genre of RPG, and they're thinking about the kind of experience they want to make at their table, Chris, what are some of the techniques? What's in the toolbox? Obviously, if you're a filmmaker, we all know the things they're doing to the camera. You described to The Exorcist about the point of view shots and the door that you don't want to open. And, they've got all kinds of other things, jump scares classically, right? Some of those things you can do at the table, some of them probably not. What's the toolbox look like for the horror GM?
The toolbox comes with some warnings. So I'll start with the warnings, right? Because I think that the warnings help set up. The big warning is don't have, and this is true, of course, for all role-playing games, but I think there's a even greater temptation in horror. Don't have the whole story planned out in your head already, because we're tempted. Wouldn't it be scary when this happens? When this happens, I don't know what's going to happen. One of the big warnings, one of the things to make sure that one tool that you should not take out is the railroading tool. Instead, to me, the way to approach this is to imagine a creepy scenario where you can sprinkle in early on hints of something much worse and something much more horrific that will slowly unfold through exploration and discovery. That's always sort of growing there in the background, kind of no matter what's going on with the players, that you can tease them with, and that eventually with some ticking clock that you have in your head or some dramatic points that are going to be reached unfolds. Most horror does not hit you over the head with everything that it's got at once. In fact, just the opposite. It is a slow burn. Horror,
yeah,
my favorite horror, at least, is a slow burn. We talked about The Exorcist. The first 45 minutes of The Exorcist has nothing but like a candle like move or something like that.
Yeah, I was thinking when you mentioned that, I was thinking that the film The House of the Devil. I don't know if you ever saw that one.
Such a fantastic slow burn.
Yeah, what a slow burn. But all those little hints they give you along the way, like you mentioned, they build up, and then when it happens, you're like, oh, the warnings were there. Like,
That's right. That's right. And I think another thing that's fun with horror, and you can have fun at the table, a tool that you shouldn't run away from is, telegraphing what's going to happen, but in its own way, that's scary enough. So in the Halloween adventure that I've designed now for a few of the groups I'm running in, there's a Pumpkin King festival at a small village. There's a festival of the 5 colors, and at some point they pick a villager and they dress them up as a pumpkin king. They put a pumpkin on his head. They put a scythe in his hand. Right, he's got a black coat, and this is supposed to reenact, as described. He's supposed to go door to door and knock on the door and threaten to kill everyone. But then you give the pumpkin king candy. Right,
What can go wrong?
right, right, exactly. And at the end of the whole thing, the pumpkin king's got all this candy, and everyone comes out, and all the kids get the candy. That's the festival, and the festival is supposed to be sort of but right? The players know something horrible is going to happen. They know that I'm basically telling them this is going to all go terribly wrong. That's okay. It's okay. It doesn't have to all be a surprise. The dread can be with coming like, I know this is going to go bad, and I may even know how, and I still can't stop it. I still have to just confront it. That to me is great horror.
It's like a bass solo. You just it's coming. You can't stop it.
I'm on the roller coaster. I know what's going to happen. I see the thing in front of me. Why am I putting myself on this? But here it comes.
I'm going to ask a question now. Okay, first of all, I have not seen The House of the Devil. Had not even heard of it before you guys both went, oh yeah, that's a great movie. So, but I wanted to actually come back to something you said earlier, Chris, about not going with railroads, but then also the sense of inevitability you talked about. For some people, that might feel like you're trying to square a circle. So can you unpack that a little bit?
Absolutely. So the not railroad is not trying to hit any particular beat, right? Like it's not, if you envision that these two players are going to have this great moment of tension, or they must go into the house underneath it. Those are the sorts of things I say, no, you got to be flexible and improvisational. But at the same time, yes, there does need to be a sort of growing horror that at first can't be stopped, And to me, this is all good game mastering. Is I grew up in a never railroad, but you have to railroad a little bit. You have to have some direction to things. The art is not to overdo it and to have most player agency be completely sincere, and some of it feel sincere, but the doom is coming all the same. I think that's perfectly legit for game mastering.
Yeah, there is a kind of a meta contract that I think players and GMs have with each other, right? And I saw this interesting little video clip recently from Deborah Ann Wool, who seems to be, as far as I can tell, one of the most delightful GMs you could encounter. And she said that her advice for players was always to follow the thread. That's where the GM's prepared something for you. And so what you're saying is like, yeah, have those threads, be ready to bring those layers in. And as a player in a horror game, be ready to let yourself be scared. Be ready to go down into the basement where the terrible things are, or whatever that might be, and follow along, because that's where the preparation is.
So Chris, I want to know what's a little bit different about horror games and traditional games, and also like kind of a follow-up. Maybe this kind of hints at what you were mentioning in your last response is, do you use like one-shots? Are they multiple sessions, or do you run campaigns? And what would you recommend?
That's really great. Most players don't have the stamina. This is not a criticism. And most GMs don't have the stamina for a long horror campaign. If you're in the space that I had described, where there's a lot of vulnerability, there's a lot of ways that things can go wrong. The beats of horror are different. I mean, most of the horror games have at least one or more character, if not perish, then something horrible happens to them.
Yeah.
Now that changes if you're in like Ravenloft, for Dungeons & Dragons is Ravenloft. That's a campaign, but again, that to me is more the trappings of the Gothic and all the rest of it, less like session by session spooky scares and all the rest of it. There are, however, some folks, and I found myself in this camp at some point in my younger years, who really can do the long haul. And the long haul for me, some of the best long haul horror storytelling is still Chaosiism's Call of Cthulhu stuff. Horror on the Orient Express or Masks of Nyarlathotep. Those are epic campaigns. Horror on the Orient Express is more sort of straight up horror that you can just keep going and going with the dread and the misery and the madness and the elder gods and all the rest of it. But that really does take a certain kind of player commitment, because week after week, session after session, you're on the brink of madness, ruin, and failure.
That can be exhausting.
Most of us, I mean, I'm a middle-aged man now at this point. It's like I'm like I just described my week. I want to come in.
And Chris, you also kind of mentioned about railroading a little bit.
Yeah.
In a campaign, railroading can be problematic, whereas in a bottle episode, in a kind of horror genre, kind of being trapped in a confined space, something moving kind of in that direction seems more appropriate.
Absolutely, especially if you sit down and you're like, well, look, let me give you a great example of this. I've not played this yet. I purchased it recently. I can't wait to play it. And maybe this is an unfair example, but I love it. There's this game called The Zone,
Okay.
which is based on or inspired by Annihilation, the book Annihilation, Jeff and the movie Annihilation. In this role-playing game, as I understand it, you enter into it knowing that at the end everyone's gone, everyone is dead. That's it. I mean that. But the fun
Spoilers.
is the laughs we had along the way, kind of thing, right? It's
Right.
random cards. We're talking about mutations and all this other stuff that went down. To me, that's massively railroading in some sense. I know exactly where the railroad's going and what the destination is, but the fun is in the trip. I think that's fair game for a short-term session. Yeah.
So, Chris, obviously we've been talking about the toolbox. We've been talking about horror techniques. We've talked about indie games that kind of play into certain parts of this continuum we've talked about between sort of the monster tropes versus real tension at the table. You've told us a bit about vulnerability. And one of the things we've talked a bit about too, I'll just call information control. It's that kind of long, slow burn you guys talked about. I was wondering if you could share with us an example of something you've maybe done at the table that you found effective, a technique you might use consistently, or something that you think a new GM might use successfully that's not too hard to pick up.
One is the red herring. The red herring is the thing that seems to scream problem but isn't, because it's a feint. So I'll use my Pumpkin King example. Folks sort of know that something is going to go wrong with this festival, but it's a festival, and so the first session, the players got to go around and bob for apples and try to dunk the dunce and do all the sort of festival things, and winners would get a Pumpkin King doll, a little straw doll in the shape of a Pumpkin King, and they are completely convinced that the dolls are going to come alive and eat them, and they aren't. My hope is that by the end of the sessions, they'll have wanted that scenario compared to the one that I unfold in front of them. We wish that it was the dolls coming alive to eat our faces off at night.
I'd have preferred the dolls.
Man, I would hold that hook, line, and sinker.
But that's the feint, right? So you're holding one thing in front of them where it's like, there's something that's got to go wrong with this festival. Indeed, here's something else that's just meant to sort of weigh in the back of their head. Should I be scared of this too? Is this person, are these people creepy? And some of it you bring in, some of it you don't. But that feint, the reason I mention this is what it does is it keeps players on the edge. It keeps them not quite knowing everything that's going, or thinking that they can know everything that's going to happen. And that's, we got to worry about the dolls. We worry about the festival. We got to worry. That it keeps them frosty, to allude to an Aliens quote. It keeps them frosty where they need to be. I hope that's a good example.
That's a great example. Yeah, it's fantastic. It keeps your imagination working and working against them and for you, the GM.
Right, that's right.
So that sound means it's time for us to do our tune-up segment this week. When we have an interview on Chris, we ask our guests to tune up our own thinking and techniques around horror. What do you think is the easiest kind of horror game to play? We've talked about that continuum and so on. Where would you suggest somebody that's new to this starts, and what kind of advice would you offer for them getting ready for that first session?
I think the best advice I could give to GM in terms of what kind of horror story to unfold is bring players into the one that you already love. That love is going to come forth. Do you love slashers? Come up with a slasher story. Do you just can't get enough of Bram Stoker's Dracula and the crumbling castles? That's the way to go. The reason for that is, and I think this is true for game mastering in general, your love and commitment to the story will show up in lots of ways, big and small. at the table. It will also help you improvise when needed. If your bread and butter is slasher, then when the players throw you a curveball, and we know that they will always throw you a curveball, you've consumed so much of this, you know where you can go. You can handle this. So I would say find which kind of horror you love. And if you don't love any horror, hurrah, you get to watch a whole bunch. I've got recommendations, right? You can find a kind of horror that you like, and start there, because you'll be most comfortable already with the kind of storytelling and pacing and tropes that are part of it, and that's going to serve you quite well at the table.
Chris, this has been really exciting. It's nice to meet you, first of all,
nice to meet you.
but also, a horror enthusiast. It's always nice to meet a fellow kindred spirit. So thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me on.
I feel like I've learned so much today that I maybe didn't want to know, and I fear to open that door.
Well, I'll leave it at this. I'm rereading Stephen King's Night Shift, his first collection of short stories. The story that I'm in right now is called I Am the Doorway, speaking of the door, where it's about an astronaut who goes to Venus and comes back and then discovers that little tiny eyes and eyeballs are showing up like pimples all over his skin as these alien entities are like seeing the world through. Isn't that the most unnerving image ever?
He needs to see a skin doctor.
He is the doorway. That's the story.
Okay, well, friends, as you can tell, this was a great time with Chris Robichaud.
Yep.
That is our episode of Tabletop Tune Up for this week. And next time, plan on enjoying our episode on factions and secret societies.
And everybody, please, if you have anything that you need tuned up, any questions you might have, please send them in. You can post them on our YouTube channel. You could email us at, Tabletop Tune Up?
At gmail.com. That's right. If you have ideas for world building elements, table management, adventure design, anything you like that you think as a GM you'd like a little help with, we're here to help you tune that up. So thanks again. And until next time, keep those dice rolling.
TuneUp. Level up your fun. TuneUp. Your quest has now begun. TuneUp will show you how it's done. TuneUp.